Shalom Aleichem. Welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Public Programs and Publishing. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for this evening's program, How the Holocaust Changed the Yiddish Language, with Hannah Pollin-Galay. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your audio and your video will be off throughout the program. You may send us your questions via the question panel at the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and please refrain from comments so that we can get to all of the questions this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's presenter, Hannah Pollin-Galay. Hannah is an assistant professor in the Department of Literature at Tel Aviv University, where she is also head of the Jona Goldrich Institute for Yiddish Language, Literature, and Culture. In that role, she directs projects such as the Naomi Prawer Kadar International Yiddish Summer Program, an online journal for Yiddish and Hebrew, literary translation. Hannah researches and teaches in Holocaust studies and Yiddish literature and has published translations of the poetry of Chava Rosenfarb, as well as that of Benjamin Harshov. Her scholarly articles have appeared in journals such as Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Jewish Quarterly Review, and Jewish Social Studies. Her first book, Ecologies of Witnessing, Language, Place, and Holocaust Testimony, came out with Yale University Press in 2018. And her second book, Occupied Words, What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish, will be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2024. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Lisa. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, and thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to share this work with you. I will now share my slides. Okay. So the title of my lecture is How the Holocaust Changed the Yiddish Language. And based on the title, you might be thinking I'm going to be giving you a very technical lecture, something with statistics that only linguists can follow. But actually, I want to make the argument that this is a very human story, that there are real people who were passionately committed to documenting how the Yiddish language changed during the Holocaust in camps and ghettos, and that their main goal was that people like you, that future generations would give a listen and hear about these changes because they were very important to them at the time. So I'll begin with one such story. In June of 1945, an emaciated man named Isel Kaplan stood before an audience of other ailing survivors and refugees at the Schwabing Hospital in Munich and delivered an ambitious speech in Yiddish entitled The Transformation of Our Folk Creativity. This is what his lecture looked like in his notes. And he stood with a swollen, bandaged head as he embarked on a sweeping overview of the history of folk creativity, literature from below. He started with Johann Herder's notion of the voices of the peoples, moved through the contributions of Jewish cantors and wedding performers, and then to the modern writers like Shin Ansky, whose renowned play, The Dybbuk, was inspired by ethnographic research, as well as the folklore project of Chaim Nachman Bialik and Alter Druyanov. In his diary, which I'm showing you on the screen now, Kaplan described his motivations for giving this speech as intergenerational education. He wrote that young men in the hospital had, quote, grown sick of card playing and begun to gather around him, looking to him as a mentor. At that point, when the young men looked to Kaplan as a mentor, they invited him to give a public lecture for all of the survivors in the hospital. And this was the speech that he chose to give. He unfurled centuries of literary, musicological, and sociological developments, and then crowned his speech with a rallying cry to his audience of convalescent survivors and refugees, People can bear witness, help save our inheritance. It may not be surprising to you at all that Kaplan, a university-trained historian and published writer, would urgently seek to create literary and cultural continuity in 1945, even while still recovering his basic bodily functions. But what you might find surprising is the specific nature of this valuable inheritance that Kaplan so hoped to preserve and to elevate for future generations. In his lecture notes, Kaplan exemplifies what he means by this valuable inheritance with a list of Yiddish neologisms coined in the ghettos and camps. And here he includes no written definitions, but I'll go ahead and define them for you. The first term is klepsy, which meant theft in the ghettos. It was drawn from the Greek word klepto. Afenskovorode, which was a term specific to Auschwitz, which meant to the crematoria. Yazdin koimin, driving into the chimney, the verb coming from Polish. Musulman, a term you've heard of, most likely. Musulman, which literally means Muslim, but in this Holocaust context meant an emaciated prisoner. Vitamin, literally vitamin, which meant special protection. Mru and pru, which was onomatopoeia for beef and horse flesh, respectively, imitating the animal calls. Knepelach, literally buttons, but here in the Holocaust context became to mean golden coins. And lastly, yushnik, literally pig feed, the name of a soup in some camps. So it was this motley crew of semi-obscenities, lingual hybrids, crude metaphors, and onomatopoeias that were, to Kaplan's mind, the very culmination of centuries of Jewish creative output. Following this very brief list, which seems to have been part of Kaplan's hospital lecture, Kaplan's notebook turns into his first draft of a dictionary, 43 pages, tightly packed with roughly 760 terms of this same sort, all terms invented or radically changed in meaning in the ghettos and camps. Kaplan would begin to publish these terms with full glosses included 1 year later under the title of a serial column 1 year later under the title Das Volksmäul in Nazi Klemm, the people's mouth under the Nazi yoke. And then once seemingly due to positive feedback to his column, he edited and published this dictionary in book form in 1949 under the same title. It might seem very counterintuitive to us today that someone would find it urgent in the wake of collective catastrophe and personal near-death experiences to write a dictionary, and a dictionary of such a strange, painful argot at that. This would seem an especially strange choice in the case of the Yiddish language, given its fragile state at this point in history. Among the many languages spoken during the Holocaust, and scholars estimate that in Auschwitz alone there were over 40 languages spoken, Yiddish stands out in the severity of the blow that it suffered under the Nazis. Linguist Neil Jacobs estimates that the Holocaust took the lives of roughly 5 million Yiddish speakers out of 11 million living worldwide before the war. And of the approximately 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust, roughly 85% were Yiddish speakers, according to Gilad Zuckerman. Beyond this tremendous loss in the number of living Yiddish speakers, the Holocaust also destroyed most of the East and Central European Jewish communities in which Yiddish was spoken, where Yiddish literature and culture were thriving, and thus where future Yiddish speakers would have emerged. So the Holocaust not only damaged Yiddish in the present, but it also damaged the Yiddish future. Given the precarious state that the Yiddish language was in after the Holocaust, why invest special time and energy in propagating Khurbn Yiddish, that is, Yiddish of the Holocaust? Why elevate words like vitamin or mru, pru, when the venerable, loftier registers of the Yiddish language were also under threat at that time? As strange as it sounds, Kaplan was not alone in choosing to work on a dictionary of Khurbn Yiddish at this moment. A Polish Jewish cultural activist from Lublin named Nachman Blumenthal, who had survived the war in the war years in the unoccupied Soviet Union, started researching and gathering Khurbn Yiddish words almost immediately upon his return to liberated Poland in 1944. His work was published as a serial dictionary between 1956 and 64, and then reprinted as a book in 81, each time under the title Werte und Wörterlich für der Khurbn Tkufe, words and phrases from the Holocaust period. And Blumenthal actually got up to 3,000 neologisms that were invented in the Yiddish language in the camps and ghettos. And again, that includes some words that were completely new, some hybrids, borrowed from other languages, and some words, old Yiddish words that had changed in meaning during the Holocaust. And that doesn't even stop with Blumenthal and Kaplan. Across the Soviet border, working completely separately from them, the Soviet linguist Elie Spivak published yet another glossary of the same sort in 1946, calling it The Language in the Days of the Great Patriotic War. And in addition to these extensive book-length efforts, there are at least 10 shorter ones, which appeared in displaced persons publications, as well as appendices to early history books. And even before this burst of post-war Yiddish glossing, people had initiated the work of recording and defining Yiddish neologisms while still in the ghettos, even while these terms were just coming into being. So here's an example from the Warsaw ghetto. Rabbi Shimon Huberband, who began a list called New Words and Old Words with New Meanings, really listening to the sounds around him and urgently writing down this metamorphosis that he perceived in the way that he and his community were speaking. Likewise, in the Lodz ghetto, many of you probably know that there was an effort to create an encyclopedia of the Lodz ghetto in the ghetto itself. And a large number of the intended entries that they planned to write for this encyclopedia were glosses of new Yiddish words. They did not complete all of these entries because the people who were working on this ghetto encyclopedia were killed, but their interest in self-reflection via the Yiddish language and via language in general, they also wrote about Polish and German, is stunning. And it does express a clear interest across the Nazi-occupied territory to study language change as it happened, and with a focus in Yiddish in particular. Together, these dictionaries and dictionary-like texts, both during the war and after the war, manifest a substantial and perplexing phenomenon that deserves our attention. It's an attempt to witness genocide, not only by narrating events, but by listing and defining words. Yiddishists were certainly not alone in claiming that the Second World War had somehow reshaped language. As is well known, the German philologist Victor Klemperer averred that the Nazis had created their own perverse dialect of German, which he called Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich. And he cataloged that in a personal memoir, Cum Lexicon, by that name in 1947. And there are multiple other examples in German studies. And we can also refer to Primo Levi's famous statement that, quote, where violence is inflicted on man, it is also inflicted on language. Scholars have been fairly attentive to these changes in the German language, Nazi Deutsch, Nazi German, as well as to these broader, more abstract reflections on violence and language like that of Levi's. But very, very little attention, very few efforts have been made to understand the Holocaust's impact on Yiddish in particular. And this scholarly lacuna is bothersome, especially because East European Jews were fascinated and perplexed by the language, the changes in their language, both during and after the war. And they showed almost a philological fervor to know what was going on with their language and to preserve it for future generations. So in my talk today, I would like to bring you into this labyrinthine world of Khurbn Yiddish, Yiddish of the Holocaust, by looking at two terms in particular, two key terms, and to trace them really almost like they're people, follow them along. And the first key word I would like to discuss is one that perplexed and preoccupied Jews both during and after the Holocaust. It's a word that worked like a meme or a hashtag would today, connecting conversations across time and space. It's a word that belongs to a vast new vocabulary relating to theft and smuggling in the ghettos and camps. And that word is Shabin, sometimes Shabin. I'll explain. So Nachman Blumenthal, one of the prime Khurbn Yiddish lexicographers, whom I mentioned earlier, he defines the word in an exceptionally long gloss of 2 pages, which begins as follows. Shabin, Shabrevin, quote, taking ownerless property, also stealing. Immediately, we should be puzzled, right? I hope you're all, you're not in front of me, so I can't see your puzzled faces, but I'm hoping that everyone is sitting at home in front of the computer puzzled by the definition I just read, because that also is very, very loaded. How can something be both taking, a verb describe both taking ownerless property and stealing? Aren't they 2 different acts? And if they are 2 different acts on 2 different moral planes, then why should they be housed in the same word? And if they're the same act, then why does he need that and? When is it permissible to take the property of killed or deported Jews? And when is that considered a wrongful act of looting? It's precisely this tension that makes the word so important to conversations in the ghetto and afterwards. Other post-war glossarists like Isel Kaplan, whom we met in the hospital in Munich, also grappled with the hazy duality of Shabrevin. Kaplan tried to clarify matters by adding a temporal dimension to his gloss, and he claims that the word initially referred only to the gathering of property abandoned by those deported from the Warsaw Ghetto, but that, quote, over time, this Shabin spread throughout Poland, and any kind of wheeling dealing came to be called Shabrevin. So according to Kaplan, the word spread geographically and it spread semantically from a very specific type of retrieval of taking property that doesn't belong to anyone to just stealing, and that when it spread geographically, the word also expanded sonically from Shabin to Shabrevin, and somehow this extra syllable represented this expansion of the word. I don't know if I buy it. It's all a little bit very neat, but you can hear the passion with which he wants to understand this same word. The number of glosses, analyses, and commentaries on Shabin and Shabrevin stretches way beyond the major Khurbn Yiddish dictionaries. The specific nuances of each gloss are less significant than the intricacy and passion with which each writer commits to the task of illuminating the word. Jonas Turko, in his memoir of the Warsaw Ghetto, discusses Shabrevin, and he condemns it scathingly as an elitist form of robbery, whereas Rochel Auerbach defines it in a light, forgiving tone. What's more, people living in the Warsaw Ghetto were also fascinated by this same word, and they examined, dissected, and debated it even as they used it. One document from the Oynig Shabbos archive, that's the archive that the historian Emanuel Ringelblum led as an underground effort in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's a document from the Oynig Shabbos archive entitled Shabrovnikis. Shabrovnikis. You can see the start of the document here on the screen, and it begins as follows. I'll read it in Yiddish and translate. Äußerlich abgerissene, abgeschließene, verkaschelt, verfedert, allemal vernommen. Ashod die Zeit mit Kinderweil etwas Schabrevin. Das heißt, Chappen in die ledige Heiser. Ot hot ihr etliche Typen. Looking worn, finished, crumpled, threadbare, and always busy. Don't waste time. You can always shabrevin something. This means grabbing things from empty houses. Below, we have a few personality types. So a shabrovnik was somebody who did the shabrevin. And what follows this initial definition is the life story of an 18-year-old orphan named David Briner, as it's relayed through an anonymous interviewer, transcriber, and editor. And clearly, in the eyes of this interviewer editor in the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a special connection between the neologism shabrovnik, a person who shabrovitz, and this teenager's life. And Briner recounts how he became a shabrovnik, and he's telling all these details about how he does the work of a shabrovnik, and then all of a sudden, and you can feel this in the text, in the document, he gets belligerent, he gets angry at the interviewer, and he says, "You're looking at me as if I've always been a shabrovnik, a wild child, but I used to go about my business as a quiet, solid kid." So it's almost like Briner is at war with this word. He needs this word shabrovnik to describe who he is. He can't tell how he's surviving in the ghetto without saying he's a shabrovnik, but he's also incredibly resentful towards the word. And the word both helps him to tell his story, to present his hard-earned survival skills, but it also embarrasses him. He has to use the word, but he doesn't really want to live inside it. That's the quote I just read you from David Briner's life story / gloss of shabrovnik. Strikingly, in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942, it was not only David Briner, the 18-year-old boy, reflecting on the word shabrevin. There is a 6-page essay on the term written by the Yiddish journalist and writer Peretz Opochinski, and this is right after the Great Deportation. So just bear this in mind. There's most of the community has been destroyed. Prospects of survival are minimal. Everything is empty, barren on the streets. And as soon as Opochinski gets a chance, when he settles down from this tremendous catastrophe, he sits down and writes a definition, 6-page definition of this word. That's how urgent it was for him to describe this word. He writes, the words chuchis and shabrevin belong to that special post-expulsion vocabulary that contains the essence of our current economic existence. Now, you'll note that there's another Khurbn Yiddish word in this same sentence, chuchis. And chuchis, that's the object of shabrevin. Those are the rags and leftover belongings that you shabrevit, that you steal. So obviously, I'm not going to go through and give you a whole long spiel on chuchis too, but what's important here is to note that this is almost always what happens in the world of Khurbn Yiddish. You need one Khurbn Yiddish word to define another one. It's like a constant figure 8. The words refer to themselves. It's a whole system of meaning rather than just isolated new terms. But Opochinski goes on, and he's not just interested in defining the semantics, that is, what does the word shabrevin mean? He also wants to share and reflect on how people behaved within this new system of meaning, what it felt like to use this word as an experience of speech. And he says, most of the time, the shabrovnikis, and remember, we just met a shabrovnik earlier in the last slide, that was David Briner. Most of the time, the shabrovnikis themselves are the ones who use this term in order to cover up their supposed shame. At first, people said geneve, ganovim, theft, thieves in simple Yiddish. But maybe those who shouted thieves felt themselves accused by the term. They too took things from houses and would never want to bear the title thief, or they simply recognized that it's nonsense to call it theft when you take something that's ownerless. Opochinski sees that the word is used to both describe a new reality and to cover up that new reality. It is at once a manipulation to call theft, to call theft shabrevin, and it is nonsense to do otherwise. In a sense, what Opochinski is implying here is that one almost has to speak euphemistically in order to participate in speech at this moment. There's no stable framework of judgment, no way that words can describe theft and non-theft in any clear way, so they can only use this internal system of Khurbn Yiddish to speak at this moment and make any sense. And he actually provides a very interesting metaphor to describe this movement between right and wrong, this constant flux between legitimate and illegitimate social behavior, this flux that's contained within the word Shabrevin. He says people are using the term every which way, whether they need to or not. They roll it and they drop it. They play around with it in this manner like children play with a ball, throwing it in the air. So you can see, you can envision this word bouncing around, people throwing it back and forth like a ball and giving it different meanings and different judgments at different times. This is the experience of speech at the moment. And Opochinski also has a message for us, for the future, about this same word. He says he wants this word to become, these expressions will enter the Yiddish language as a paradigmatic sign of this period, a siman muvhek, as cornerstones of the ghetto mentality. So it's almost as if you can hear Opochinski speaking to us. He wants us to hear this word as a sign, a symbol of what was at the time. And they were also in the ghetto debating the etymology of Shabrevin. And if there are Yiddish speakers in the audience, you're probably also, you've been scratching your head and wondering, where does this word come from? Why? What are all these sounds? Maybe some people have heard it in different languages. The etymology is very complex. I'm not going to go into it now. I will just say this. The people in the ghetto were very interested in this. They were invested in the question of where Shabrevin came from. And I think that that's a sign that they were looking for history to see how their current speech relates to the past, to lingual roots as a sign of social, cultural roots. This is a map of how Shabrevin developed. Again, I'm not going to go into it. You'll just have to read my book later if you want to go into all these details. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. And as interesting as this is, I'm guessing you have other things to do on a Thursday night. Now, Shabrevin also had a fascinating post-war epilogue. It entered the Polish language in a very ironic way. Shabrevin became actually a term that Poles used to describe Poles looting German goods, a very uncanny reversal of the word's use in the Warsaw Ghetto, where it represented Jewish victims taking from one another in order to survive massive German theft and killing. It also became an important site of debate in Zionist discourse in the DP camps for leaders like Yaakov Zerubbabel, who was a leader of the Poale Zion left movement. And he came from Palestine to visit Poland and Berlin in 1945. And he published a series of articles about what he saw there, about the Jews who survived. And Zerubbabel was actually very, very sympathetic to Yiddish culture. But he did not like Khurbn Yiddish. He did not like these new words at all. And he especially hated Shabrevin. He took this word and he picked up on it and he spoke about it and he wrote about it as a symbol of all that had gone wrong for Jews in the diaspora. And he writes, people are throwing themselves, people meaning Jews in DP camps, people are throwing themselves at easy money. They're slipping down familiar paths. Everyone is trading. Everyone is speculating. Everyone is Shabrevin. And this term Shabrevin became for him the crux of his arguments about the fact that Jewish life in the diaspora had been good, but had now gone bankrupt. That's his word, bankrot. It was bankrupt, and everyone, especially those who had never been interested in Zionism, everyone had to move to Palestine because of this cultural bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy was proven by the word Shabrevin. That's more from him. And now I'll move on to close with Shabrevin with these post-war epilogues. It's ironic. It's a sad epilogue in a way, because Opochinski got what he wanted in a way, in that future generations or post-war Jews, post-war people looked at Shabovin as a symbol of the ghetto mentality, but they didn't get it. They flattened the term to mean something just about degradation, just about victimhood, just about loss of culture, when in fact, what we saw with Opochinski and with David Brina, the 18-year-old, was a sense of movement, that it was about going back and forth between resilience and victimhood, that sense of and that was captured so well in Blumenthal's definition, and I think we can begin to see why the study of words and lexicography can capture these nuances of life in the ghettos in a way that got flattened in just regular journalism and discourse. Okay. Key term number 2, people, sometimes pupil. This is another one of those verbal hotspots of Holocaust Yiddish, a word that entered other camp languages as well. And it meant a young male sex servant, mostly in Auschwitz. I guess I should have warned you at the beginning that this talk may not be appropriate for children. This section is definitely not appropriate for children. So people. Holocaust Yiddish, Khurbn Yiddish was not appropriate for children, though children were exposed to it. The Holocaust was not appropriate for children. That's the whole point. Okay, it seems likely that this word derived, people, from a rare German neologism, people, which can mean a small boy or a penis. However, most Yiddish speakers seem to have been unaware of this German expression, and they gave people a different etymology. They understood it as a Yiddishized or diminutive form of the word doll, Puppe, from German. So a little doll became people, this male prostitute in Auschwitz. So it was a cross between Puppe, which is also slang for a female prostitute, and people, which was a male prostitute, just like it's a cross between German and Yiddish. So the term is hybrid, both in terms of gender and language background. And the phenomenon, the historical phenomenon of the people, has been well documented and explored by historians such as Robert Summer and scholars like Jeffrey Wallen, along with others. Yiddish speakers of the Holocaust era had a lot to say about the people as both a practice and a word. Nachman Blumenthal presents multiple examples of it, and Isel Kaplan defines the term at great length. He writes, capos in the Auschwitz Academy, and he uses a lot of ironic quotation marks, Kaplan. Capos in the Auschwitz Academy used to also pick out individuals, each according to his custom and style. Most of the time, it was from the younger crowd who had spent their early years without the supervision of parents, trained in Auschwitz and raised there. Some of them became the personal servants of SS men and were exploited by these masters for their basest pleasures. These young children sadly never knew that they had been denied a normal life. On the contrary, they used to be proud of their rank, to be a people, a kind of fella that was very popular in the camps. A long definition. So this is in contrast to the quick-flowing, tongue-in-cheek prose, a humorous prose that Kaplan usually uses to define and connect other terms of Khurbn Yiddish. People slows him down. The definition is still densely filled with ironic quotation marks, as we noticed, but there is something about the term that draws Kaplan into a more solemn and mournful and even earnest tone. And I believe that the notion that people, the practice, stunted intergenerational links, making aggressive non-Jewish overseers, these capos, into surrogate parents for Jewish boys, seems to have made the term especially painful. The people, in other words, emblemized a break in the parent-child bond. Compounding this intergenerational anxiety, the people may have also evoked particular revulsion and horror for male commentators. Kaplan was not alone to dwell on this term. Also, this is from Mordechai Striegler, who also dwells on the people or the pupil at length. And I believe that this can express, for these male commentators, they saw the people as a forced feminization of the male body. And in both Western and Jewish traditions, The woman's body, this is another example of a male commentator dwelling on it, Philip Friedman. In both the Western and Jewish traditions, the woman's body is often depicted as the site of cultural, moral, and lingual vulnerability. Take, for example, something some of us have just heard recently, the book of Eicha, Lamentations, in which a sexually promiscuous woman, Bat Yerushalayim, the daughter of Jerusalem, serves as a metaphor for the moral and spiritual failure of the people of Israel. Stepping into this symbolic chain and shifting the terms around, the word people represents the frightening possibility that the Nazi oppression was penetrating the male conscience and the male body in a manner that was once reserved only for women, at least in the symbolic imagination of these Jewish texts and Western texts. That is, the term people evoked intergenerational anxieties in both directions, forward and backward. It represented a rift between the present and the future, in that young men were being raised by sexual abusers rather than teachers and parents, and this is going to corrupt the future, the Jewish future. But it was also a break with the Jewish past, in which long-standing symbols of collective suffering were inverted from female to male. The sexist tradition of depicting catastrophe through a woman's body deserves contemporary critique in contemporary sensibilities, in my opinion. But at the same time, we can see how male Khurbn Yiddish speakers saw the loss of that foundational metaphor, Bat Yerushalayim, as a sign of alienation from their own history and their own textual chain. Or perhaps we should put it in the converse. These men, like Kaplan, Striegler, Friedman, who dwelled on the term of people with such anxiety and sadness, expressed their alienation from Jewish text and Jewish history by emphasizing a phenomenon that disturbed a foundational Jewish metaphor. And like Shabin, people has a fascinating, though very different, post-war afterlife. It is the title of a well-known book by the author Katsetnik, whose rich use of Khurbn Yiddish words I explore in my book. Additionally, as is not usually noted, people appears at the very center of the most significant of Holocaust memoirs, Elie Wiesel's Night. In the famous hanging scene midway through the international version of the book, the term is included in transliteration. And here I cite the English translation exactly as it appears in print. Some people are surprised because they've read this book multiple times and never noticed that the word people appears here. In his service was a young boy, a people as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the people were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread." And it goes on. And people discuss this scene at length as a moment of theological crisis where Eliezer loses faith in God. And there's so much attention paid to faith in this scene that the word people is overlooked. And in a way, we have to ask, why did Wiesel leave this term in at all, in italics, but without any explanation? And we should recall that there's a big difference between the original Yiddish version of Wiesel's memoir, which was called Die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world kept silent, which he published in 1954, and then the French version that the English is then based on. And he took out a lot of the grittier, more embarrassing, less pleasant, more bodily aspects of the memoir when he translated it from Yiddish into French. Why did he leave people in at all? I think that the term survives in a very interesting way. It survives a translation in a very interesting way. It can either be a sign that the reader can't know everything, a sign of what we can't know, that there was a translation, that there's a whole world that's missing, or for those in the know who know what a people meant without having a definition, the word appears almost like a dog whistle, calling out to his community to remind them of this whole world of language and meaning that has been lost in Khurbn Yiddish. So I want to close now by going back to the question that I raised in the beginning, which is why? Why do this? Why did people like Isel Kaplan, Nachman Blumenthal, and others emerge from the Holocaust years with an urgent drive to collect, document, and gloss words like Shabin in people, though these words were often vulgar and could be considered embarrassing corruptions of the Yiddish language that they loved so much? Why did they want these words to be accessible to future generations, to people like us? And I want us to think here about what Umberto Eco teaches about the dictionary as a genre. Dictionaries provide a pause, according to Eco. He writes, we presuppose a local dictionary every time we want to recognize and to circumscribe an area of consensus within which a given discourse should stay. And in the context of Khurbn Yiddish glossaries, the notion of staying is strange because obviously no one wanted to stay in the ghettos and camps. No one wanted to remain a Holocaust victim and stay in that world. But we can also think of staying in a different sense, to create a pause for the sake of recognition, to stay with them and to stay with their language in order to hear the experience on their own terms. We could almost call these Khurbn Yiddish studies an attempt or an invitation for vocal recognition, calling on future generations to witness a certain experience of language and of selfhood under conditions of genocidal erasure. And I think that Shabin and people both give us examples of the value of this pause for vocal recognition. Shabin shows us that there was an and, there was an also, there was a swing, there was flux between victimization and ingenuity, survival and suffering. And in the case of people, which reached future generations through Elie Wiesel's book, studying the word more closely brings us beyond Wiesel's enigmatic silence and his theological abstractions into a very concrete world of hierarchies and cultural symbols and sexuality and bodily experience, and makes victimhood more of a grounded experience and a more human experience in that sense. And the Khurbn Yiddish dictionaries, I believe, ask us to see this more fuller human picture, to witness it. And this is, I believe, the legacy that Isel Kaplan asked his young audience in the hospital in Schwabing to protect and to carry on. And this is the legacy that I hope to share with you through my work and through my book. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. It's such interesting work, which I will use as the way to lead into our first question, which is a thank you from one of the participants. And what drew you to this work?
So in my previous work, I compared oral Holocaust testimonies in Hebrew, English, and in Yiddish. And I was interested in how people might remember differently in different languages. So while I was working on that, which was my dissertation, my first book, I started to come across these very strange words that I'd never heard before in Yiddish. And I'm not a native speaker, but I know the language very well. I read a lot of Yiddish literature, and I'd come across these words like the word steppen for work. I'd never heard that as a term for work before, or vitaminchik, yushnik, some of these words. And I also noticed that the survivors, the witnesses, were very interested in these words. They would emphasize them, they would refer to them again and again. And I think I used this metaphor in my talk, but it started to feel like a hashtag, like this was their way of connecting to other people's testimonies, was by using this key word. And then I discovered the dictionaries, and the dictionaries were at first a tool for me to help. The Khurbn Yiddish dictionaries helped me to understand what these words meant. And then I started to look at the dictionaries themselves, and I said, what is the story behind them? Why did people collect these words, and how? So that's how I came to it.
let's see, we've got a lot of questions here. Wonderful lecture. Why are all the compilers of the dictionaries you cite men?
Yeah, that's a very, very important point. And it's actually it became a focus of my study. This is I mean, it was a sexist world that they were living in. And men had more chances to do scholarship in general in 1940s and 50s than women. The men talked about women, right? As I mentioned, they used women as a symbol to discuss their own suffering. And I was also very bothered and interested to know, how did women feel about this, being used as a symbol for degradation, suffering, catastrophe. So actually, though she's not a glossarist, the poet and novelist Chava Rosenfarb took up these Khurbn Yiddish words, and she explores them with just as much depth and passion through her poetry and through her novels as do these male commentators through their dictionaries. So in the arc of my book, I end with Chava Rosenfarb as a response to all of these male commentators. And I think that what she has to say is very intelligent, both sometimes as a rejoinder, and other times as a way of completing what the male commentators couldn't say because they didn't have that awareness from their male perspective.
Fascinating. And for those who watch these programs, I always indulge myself by getting to ask a question. And my question was, did these words find their way into the literature? And Chava Rosenfarb was one in particular that I thought of in her short stories.
Yes, the answer is yes. And in the book, I focus on Katsetnik, who's often considered a Hebrew writer. I actually argue that he wrote originally in Yiddish, and he uses these words a lot, and not just a lot. It's not just a matter of amount. It's the rich, creative reclaiming of the words that makes it so important to read. And Rosenfarb, there's others, Yerachmiel Brix uses them a lot. Mordechai Striegler, there are a lot. There's a lot. Actually, the Yiddish Book Center's OCR word search tool helped me to make that statement in a more based scientific way, rather than just my impressions based on whatever I could read, because I could actually do word searches and see where these different words came up, and they come up in Yizkerbücher also. I'll tell you where they don't come up is in journalism. I think that the newspaper editors decided this was not Yiddish, and they didn't want these words, with the exception of when they're commenting on the word, like Shabravin, as in Zerubbabel. So it was pushed out of print in some realms, but where individual authors had control, they did use them and they explored them. They didn't just use them, they explored them. And the words also survived. So yeah, this is also a new way to read post-war Yiddish literatures, to look for these words and to see the conversations that arise when we see these words as a mode of reading and as a connector, as a hashtag, as a way of connecting conversations. The words also, I believe, haunt other languages. I mentioned how Shabravin goes into Polish, and I think that in Hebrew, in contemporary Hebrew, there are some Khurbn Yiddish words that were translated into Hebrew, but are used in the way that they were in the camps and ghettos. That's somebody else going to have to follow up on that one. But the use in post-war Yiddish literature is prominent and fascinating.
I'm having to scroll through here, so forgive me, but basically one of the questions was, did this language, these new Yiddish words find their way to other places, such as into America, into Israel, Canada?
Yeah, it's a similar question that we just addressed. It did in print literature, like individually authored print literature. They did in the Größer Wörterbuch, that the big Yiddish dictionary that Yofi and others were planning but couldn't get past Aleph. You can see the Khurbn Yiddish words in there, but they were also erased a lot because Khurbn Yiddish was like the Yiddish of Yiddish. It was embarrassing to Yiddish speakers the way that Yiddish embarrassed, Hebrew and English speakers in other contexts. So there was there were also those who wanted to get rid of the words, like Hey Leivik, when he visited the DP camps and he received the poet, Hey Leivik, the Yiddish poet, he received the hero's welcome. It was a big event for him to come. And he writes about a Khurbn Yiddish word, actually writes about the word katsetnik, which was a Khurbn Yiddish word for prisoner. And he says, yeah, I get it. It's letting the victims hear themselves. I can tell they're very attached to this word, but it lacks euphony, meaning it's just not nice. It's not pleasant to the ears, these words. And Avram Sutzkever is an example of someone who starts using these words. He uses them during the war. He uses them in his memoir von Vilna Ghetto, of the Vilna Ghetto, and then he moves away from them. So not everyone was keen on keeping these words going.
Participant, thank you so much for fascinating talk. I can't wait to read your book. Will the book itself contain a glossary of these terms for scholars to use when reading Yiddish works from this period?
Great question. So I do have a glossary. The glossary is only of the words that I use in the book because, I don't want the book to be thousands of pages. No, I mean, not even the Yiddish Book Center would be willing to sell a book that long. So maybe, maybe in the future I can translate the dictionaries, but the dictionaries exist, for Yiddish speakers, you can go and read the dictionary itself. I can't possibly duplicate the work that these, scholars did. And in any case, it's great. There are other Yiddish scholars out there who can keep it going. So what I do is I tell the story, why people wanted to have these dictionaries. Then I go through and I trace, a certain set of key terms. And then I talk about, how they're integrated into literature. And I have my own modest glossary for the purposes of reading the book. And beyond that, hey guys, the world is your oyster. Go for it.
Are you finding that this is helpful for translators?
I hope so. I hope so. I'm just beginning to share my work now. I've had people ask me, I've had actually another, colleague and friend of the Yiddish Book Center, Justin Cami. I know that this was helpful for some of the terms that Sutzkever used in his Vilna Ghetto memoir when he was translating it, and Peter Davies, who's a eminent scholar of translation in Great Britain, has found some of this useful. So I'm only giving you anecdotal evidence because I'm only beginning to share the work now. So I don't know if it'll be useful or not. My as I keep saying, my main goal was to tell the human story that these words contain, both in the words themselves and then the human story around the words, of why people wanted to preserve them and hand them on to us.
In your opinion, how should these words be interacted with today among current Yiddish speakers and learners?
That's a really wonderful question. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, actually, because, we don't want to be in a circumstance where we're using a word for an underage, sexually abused child. So we don't want to romanticize these words. And we, God forbid, don't want to be in a situation where these words would be necessary, or to put someone else in a situation where these words would be said. I think that the dictionary, as strange as this sounds, I think the dictionary can be seen almost as a choreographed visitation ritual. Like, you can open the dictionary and you can read the words and you can read the conversations about these words and be in this world of Khurbn Yiddish for a time, and then close it and go on with something else. So I think that the dictionary is giving us a practice almost. And that's why I think they were so interested in this genre of the list. And the dictionary was a popular genre. This was appearing in DP newspapers that were printed right after the Holocaust. Like, I don't know what the equivalent would be today, like the weather or, updates on your cell phone. This was a popular genre. And I think that there's something cathartic about being able to visit these words and then go back them and move in and out in that choreographed way.
I'm going to end with this question. There are many more left in there, but I don't think we have time for all of them, unfortunately, and many appreciations. But could you repeat the name of your book and tell us when it will be coming out?
Sure. And I just noticed that Chava Rosenfarb's daughter is here, Goldie Morgenthaler, who helped me so much, so generously. So anyway, the title of the book is Occupied Words, What the Holocaust Did to Yiddish. And it's supposed to come out in almost exactly a year with the University of Pennsylvania Press. And anyone whose question didn't get to be answered, you can find my email from the Tel Aviv University website, and I can do my best to be in touch. Or you can find me on social media, and I'm really grateful that so many people, and surprised that so many people came to hear this. And I'm really, really happy to have the chance to be in my home court of the Yiddish Book Center, where I worked in high school and in college. I worked at the Yiddish Book Center as a cashier and a tour guide, and a librarian from the age of 16 through the age of 24. So thanks to the Yiddish Book Center too.
And Hannah, I was going to thank you at the end for everything you did at the Yiddish Book Center. You're a big part of our early years. Well, not such early years, but a lot of history. So, and we look forward to having you walk through the doors again pretty soon when we reopen.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the new exhibit. I'm so excited. Thank you.
Can't wait to see it either. It's very exciting. October 15th, everybody mark your calendar. It's going to be quite a day. Again, thank you, Hannah, for your work, for everything you do, and for really a fascinating topic. And we may indulge and have you back again when the book comes out.
I would love that. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye. I want to thank our producer, as always, Elizabeth Carteropoli, who makes everything run seamlessly behind the scenes. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. To see a full calendar of events, to register for any of our programs, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. And speaking of live, we will continue to do our Thursday virtual programs, but I'm excited to say that Elizabeth and I have just worked on the fall calendar, and we have some live events at the Yiddish Book Center, including October 15th, which is, mark your calendars, the opening of our new permanent core exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture. You can learn more on our site. Until then, I want to thank all of our members whose support makes our ongoing work in all different areas possible. So please consider supporting, joining, what have you, by visiting yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. I look forward to welcoming you back right after the Labor Day holiday. Until then, enjoy the rest of the summer days, and thanks for joining us.